But next one is the panel, which we will indeed discuss Icelandic language and indeed technology. And Guðni has made a numerous references to Microsoft to technology, because that is the huge barrier of using those minority language as Icelandic is. I would like to ask the panel to come up here on the do we have the panel here? Okay. Yeah. Well, I was getting a little nervous.
So good morning. My name is Ingrid Peterson, or Ingrid Peterson in the U.S. I was supposed to be sitting in one of those chairs, but given that the moderator is not here, I am going to become the moderator, which will put a completely different spin on this entire thing, I have to tell you. So I just caution all of you. But just to introduce myself, I was recently retired a couple of months ago as the Executive Vice President for Technology and Finance at Nintendo. So my role on the panel was really to talk about the business implications of language and localization translation. But I think what we'll start with effectively is introduction of the panel themselves. So if you would introduce yourself, a little bit about what your background is, as well as your specific take on any questions that may come from the audience today.
Okay, so I guess I'll start off. I'm Richard Sproat. I'm a research scientist at Google. My background is in linguistics and computational linguistics. I've been doing research in those areas for over 30 years now. I'm not completely ignorant of Icelandic. I actually did an undergraduate thesis on Old Icelandic, on the syntax of Framkalsaga Freyskoða, so I know something about the language, although I don't claim to be able to speak it. But I guess as sort of a general point, which I'm sure that Hal will also reiterate upon, is that there's really no technological barriers to bringing up all kinds of systems, speech recognition, machine translation in Icelandic. The main issue is just the amount of data that there is. And I checked yesterday, and I'm not sure that this is a good measure of the amount of resources for a language, but there are, just as sort of as a gauge, there are about 5.4 million articles in Wikipedia in English and about 45,000 in Icelandic. Now, actually, that's rather good if you think about it, because that means there's about one article per 7-ish speakers of the language, which is far more than there are for English, but it's not really very much data. And all of these so-called artificial intelligence techniques, they're good to the point that they are good, but they do depend on having lots of data. I can say more about that issue and why that's actually, in a sense, good for us later on, but maybe I should turn this now to Hal.
Yeah, so I'm Hal DeMay. I'm a professor at University of Maryland, and right now I'm on sabbatical at Microsoft Research in New York. So I have no connection to Icelandic. Beyond what I read on Wikipedia and several other linguistic sources in preparation for coming here, so that I wasn't totally ignorant. But I largely agree with Richard, right? Like the technology that we're talking about is largely driven by data and sort of by will of actually making it happen. There's one example that maybe I'll spend 30 seconds giving, because I think it's interesting, is the case of Malagasy. So Malagasy has far more speakers than Icelandic, but the digital presence of Malagasy data about 10 years ago was virtually zero. And this was before sort of the big AI hype and things like that. And basically a group of activists, Malagasy speaker activists, decided that they wanted to fix this problem. And so there's a website called Global Voices. I don't know if people have heard of this, but it's news from around the world that's been translated by volunteers into various languages. And so this group of Malagasy speakers sort of took it upon themselves to translate large portions of Global Voices into Malagasy. And the result is that we now have sufficient data in Malagasy to build reliable translation systems. And so I don't think the exact same issue happens with Icelandic, because I think there actually is a substantial amount of translated data, but one of the things that the president brought up earlier was the issue of speech, and I think this is perhaps a bigger issue. And so I think one of the things that I'd like to encourage people to think about is like what role can maybe even like social movements have in generating data that technology can then use to improve the state of technology for Icelandic language.
Yeah, hello, my name is Anna Björk Nicolasdóttir. I'm a computational linguist at the Reykjavik University, where I am working at the Language and Voice Lab, mainly on speech technology at the moment, and where we are absolutely dealing with a sparse data problem for Icelandic. Maybe I'll introduce to you the work I did last year with two colleagues of mine, Jón Sigurdsson and Steindór Steingrímsson. We did a report on Icelandic language technology for the Icelandic Ministry of Education, where the task was to summarize the status of language technology for Icelandic and also to lay out a 5-year action plan for the development of language technology in Iceland, called the Action Plan 2018 to 2022. What we stress in this report is, of course, the importance of developing resources, tools, and knowledge in Iceland for Icelandic language technology. But also very important is to establish connections with global players like Google, Microsoft, and co. to seek to make Icelandic a part of the language-based solutions of these companies, of the products that are already in Iceland being used in English. And yeah, and another aim of this report is also that everything that will get funded within this program shall be made open source and freely available for everybody to use or to develop, to take it further, so that we will make establish infrastructure of Icelandic language technology, Icelandic resources, data, prepared data for the development of language technology. And I'm, of course, coming from the language technology field, and I think a program like this is really essential for the future of Icelandic. I think we still have time. We don't have much time, but we have time to catch up with technology, and we should do it. We should start right away. Maybe want to add one last thing that when we're talking about the importance of language technology for Icelandic, we can't forget about the real purpose and the real purpose of language being the human communication, the purpose for human communication, and we should really do a great effort in encouraging children, young people to develop really thorough language skills in their interhuman communication. And it's not only about communicating with gadgets, because this is really the unique human skill that we should develop, and it's unique to humans, and we should keep that lead and not think that communicating to technology is everything.
Yeah, I'm Eirik. Do you hear me? My name is Eirik Rögnvaldsson, and I'm professor of Icelandic language and linguistics at the University of Iceland. I have worked on a number of subjects. I started out as a syntactician, but for the last 20 years I've mainly been working on language technology and related projects. I participated in a number of both domestic and international projects. For instance, I was the leader of the Icelandic part of the European MetaNet project in 2011 to 2013. And one of the main deliverables of that project were detailed reports on the status of language technology for 30 European languages. And it turned out that Icelandic was near the bottom with respect to language technology support. Only Maltese was below us. So this was maybe one of the reasons for developing this language technology plan that Anna talked about. Now, as the President mentioned, Iceland has gone through tremendous changes in the past decade, both sociologically and technically. There's been an explosion in tourism. I think the number of tourists has increased by around 30% per year for the past 5 to 6 years, and the number of foreign workers has increased dramatically, and globalization has also affected young speakers' attitudes. Young Icelanders don't necessarily see Iceland as their home in the future. They want to study abroad, work abroad, and live abroad, and so on. And they realize, of course, that Icelandic will not be of much use outside Iceland. And there are indications that this has changed their attitudes towards Icelandic. They don't find the language as important as older generations did. And on the technical side, the advent of smartphones has had dramatic effects because everyone, even young children, now have smartphones. They are connected to a mostly English-speaking world 24/7. And content providers like Netflix and also YouTube and others are important in this respect. And of course, these innovations are found all over the world, but in most bigger language communities, the programs people are watching are in their mother tongue for the most part. In Iceland, even very young children are watching programs on Netflix and YouTube videos in English without English subtitles, which they wouldn't be able to read anyway. So to this, we may add interactive computer games where players all over the world are communicating in English. And the most recent threat to Icelandic might be voice control. If we are forced to communicate with Siri and Amazon Alexa and Google Assistant and Microsoft Cortana, etc. in English, Icelandic will lose a very important domain. And this is very important. I mean, because if a language becomes unusable in one domain, this may be the first step on the way to the death of this language. I'm not afraid of individual loan words or individual words changing inflectional classes or verbs starting to govern other cases than they did before. But if Icelandic becomes unusable in one domain, this might be, as I said, the first step to its death. And especially if this particular domain is the digital domain, because for some years ago we could talk about the digital domain as one special domain, but we can't do that any longer because the digital domain is all around us. So this is why it's of vital importance that Icelandic becomes usable in this domain.
So I'm going to ask a couple of questions of the panel. Just answer as you will if you have some insights. And then I'm going to open up to the audience for some questions. Question number one for me is, over the years, given my experience in technology for companies that needed to communicate product information and value, needed to communicate across multinational boundaries on how to build an airplane or how to build a video game or a video console, for example. The challenge of that as a business was the simplicity of doing it in any given language we choose to go to, not only for the translation, but also for the localization. Localization meaning what's the cultural result of what you're putting out there. My question for you is, what are either technical or linguistic activities going on now, for example, around Icelandic, that will make it simpler for Icelandic to be included in translation and localization engines, or enough content available, and as you were saying, to make those engines work well at the translation and localization of Icelandic as a language? Any thoughts on that? Maybe start.
Yeah, this is like the issue of data, of prepared data, because the technology is so large. extent there. So we need to collect and prepare data for Icelandic. We actually have a problem with data to develop translation, automatic translations, which is work that is starting in Iceland right now. Recently, we had an opening of so-called gigawords corpus of Icelandic text. So we have a billion tokens which are prepared in a linguistic way to be used in whatever language technology product. So this is in a sense the most important work for now for us is the preparation of data to be able to transfer it to the existing technology, to develop, include Icelandic also in existing products and developing new ones. Yeah.
With enough of a corpus of Icelandic activities, so the technologies in fact have enough ability to do machine learning around that set of translations, right?
In many cases, yeah.
And is that helpful in the technology implementation?
I mean, broadly, yes. I mean, certainly getting more and better data is always going to be helpful. I'm not sure it really addresses whether it addresses the question you're asking, though. And maybe I don't quite understand the question. Is it?
Let me clarify. So, for example, I had an experience in the early 2000s where I had a team. We went to visit Amazon. It's like 2003, and we asked them, "How do you do your translation of all the websites in different languages?" And they said, "Well, we start in English, and then we turn it over to 3 teams: French, Spanish, German, and they spend 3 months taking all of that and making it go into those languages. And then, as we started discussion, we said, look, there's a layer of sort of frameworks for localization of websites, localization of reference data, localization of databases and the likes. And as you develop that framework and those tools got simpler, we were able to go to languages. Amazon and other companies I was with were able to go to languages much more quickly. And so it happened instantly. It happened pretty much at the same time. Amazon started launching their websites simultaneously in multiple languages. What is happening now in the toolkits that are being built? Bing Translate, Google Translate, the 2 biggest engines that I know of to do this, to make it easier for multiple languages to be incorporated.
I see. Well, I mean, so I guess getting back to the point, I mean, more data is going to certainly help with that, especially, obviously translated data, something that's, the kind of stuff that you, I mean, say you're Amazon and say you want to, translate product descriptions or whatever it is into Icelandic. I mean, if that's what we're talking about. So obviously having appropriate data of that kind would be useful. There is, I mean, I would have to say, though, that you still are going to need some language specialists involved, right? I mean, I don't see there's any way around that at the present time. You're not going to trust current technology to do the job for you without somebody checking the results. I wouldn't.
So I think there's a lot of hype about completely automating things. But there's also a substantial amount of work on human assisting technologies, right? So how do you make human translators happier and more efficient, which are often at odds. So one of the things we have been working on for the past 5 years or so is in the space of simultaneous translation. And recently we've started a project on, instead of trying to build automatic simultaneous interpreters, help human simultaneous interpreters do their job better or more efficiently, right? Because it's a very mentally taxing job, and in many cases it has strong repercussions if you get things wrong. And so I think in cases like you're mentioning where you want to re-outfit Amazon.com in another language or something like that, I totally agree. You're definitely not going to trust some off-the-shelf translation system. And so I think that there's a lot of work, including at big tech companies and also at a number of startups, on trying to build technology to help humans do this job better. And I think in high-stakes environments like this, that's probably what you want, at least in the short term, perhaps the long term too.
I want to perhaps change the subject a bit. We have been talking about the possible threats of technology to the Icelandic language. But is it a real threat? Do we know anything about that? I mean, is Icelandic changing, or will Icelandic change, or even die because of technology? Together with my colleague Sigrid Sigurdsson, who is a professor of Icelandic at the University of Iceland, who specializes in language acquisition, I'm now conducting a large research project on the effects of English on the Icelandic language and on the Icelandic language community. The project is entitled Modeling the Linguistic Consequences of Digital Language Contact. And in this project we are studying people's attitudes towards Icelandic and English and trying to measure the amount of exposure to English, trying to find out whether English is starting to affect Icelandic syntax and vocabulary. We have conducted an online survey with 5,000 speakers, and we are in the process of conducting deep interviews with 400 speakers. And in this project, we are working with a concept which we call digital minoritization. That is, when a majority language in a speech community becomes a minority language in a certain domain, and in this case, the digital domain. And we are wondering whether the great amount of interactive exposure to English might have effects on children in the language acquisition period. Because it is well known that children need a certain amount of input, of interaction in their mother tongue in order to develop their own strong linguistic system. So if children are spending most of their time watching programs in English, and if their parents are so busy using their smartphones that they don't have time to talk to their children, it's at least a theoretical possibility that the children do not get enough Icelandic input. And I think this is something we need to study and need to find out. What are the effects of technology on the language?
In the interest of time, why don't we open it up to the audience for questions, either in the technical or the language realm, or in the it sounded like we were getting into a little bit about the inevitableness potentially in the digital world of Icelandic, or maybe other languages that have lower usage around the world, sort of falling by the wayside, even though keeping it strong at home is an important part of all of this. Questions? Yes. Introduce yourself if you would, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Helga Lífsdóttir, and I work at the UN. The United Nations, in fact, I was thinking when you're speaking, technology has a huge impact. But I'm wondering if, and I don't know if the panel can really respond to that, but we work with 6 languages every day, and I work, I'm editor and writer, and we work with 6 languages, and indeed, interpretation is very important. And on a daily basis, from morning to evening, we talk about languages, because all the material has to exist in 6 languages. And 6 languages every day is a lot, Arabic and Spanish or whatever. My question really is, though, what we observe at the UN, it has to do with resources. You cannot, and if there is a vision of the government of Iceland, and I am not so sure that anyone here can maybe respond to that, but if there is not a dedicated or a vision, long-term vision, with resources attached to it, it may fail in a way, because it's the social fabric, it's not really the technology, and I think Eiríkur is bringing up that part. So I'm wondering if we can leave this as a question, really. Is there a willingness yet in the Icelandic society, seeing that people want to go abroad, so still the social fabric is perhaps where you need to start. And at the UN, for example, I'm just sharing it, we have huge problems with resources related to the languages, but the member states, among them Iceland, has to work in one of the other languages. But this is something, and the EU, some of the small countries that are in the EU have benefited from the fact that, in fact, the bigger countries, it's all a big pool, they have developed or they translate everything into that language. And in some sense, in hindsight, perhaps we should have joined them and be part of that translation method. But in a way, in Iceland, just one thing, I've been away for 25 years, and Icelandic is therefore something that I have, I cherish a lot, and I read a lot in Icelandic because I love it. But I had an idea of going to Iceland with my child, and I spoke to a teacher in the north, and I thought perhaps it would be good to put him into school there. She said no. In fact, the children are speaking together when they're 6 years old in Akureyri, in the barnaskóli. They're speaking together in Iceland, in English. So in some sense, my question really is twofold. Is the government of Iceland ready yet to invest in what it requires to do this, what we are talking about here, because we seem to think it's sad that Iceland will disappear. That's what we that's the premise. But maybe if there is not that investment, willingness, and I would like to, refer to the lady here in front that spoke about, like kindergartens or camps. This doesn't exist. So I'm just wondering if somebody, I don't know how we can get that answer, if there is a vision in this direction, if there is none, this is going so rapidly that perhaps we're behind already. So I'm just asking that question too. I know it's not maybe this panel, but perhaps it could be.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting questions. As for the vision and the dedication of the government, I can't speak for the government as a whole, but I can say that for the technology part, there is a dedication and the promise to invest in the technology part. But as I said before, it's really crucial that we take it into the schools, into the kindergartens, into the families, that the purpose of language, just encourage children to talk to each other, to speak, to use language much more, because, and I think it's not only an Icelandic problem, it's the way of communication is changing, and it's of course also positive. You don't have to use language that much necessarily. You can express yourself with films, with pictures, with emojis, with all of this, and it's of course positive. You can have a quick expression with these methods, but at the same time, with a decrease in reading, kids read ever less, and they don't have any encouragement maybe to develop this skill of expressing complicated things with language, and this is just, and use it in everyday communication. One thing maybe to ask for the the Icelanders, is the Icelandic society willing to do this work? There is a recent, really brand new research about part of Eiríkur's project actually that did the research. Do you want to speak Icelandic? Do you want that Icelandic is available in the technology? And it was really a clear statement from this research that the will is there, and you really sense it also in society. If you go among people, you're talking about language technology for Icelandic, everybody is really thrilled. Yes, we have to do this. We want to speak Icelandic. But as you say, we have to do something about it, and that's not just about technology. Yeah.
I can also add that we hear other stories, like you mentioned, the children, Icelandic children are speaking in English to each other. But this is just anecdotal evidence. I mean, for true children who speak English, there might be 20,000 who do not. So that's actually one of the main motivation for our project, research project. We wanted to find out, I mean, how widespread is this, and so.
Another question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Shapiro, and I'm a lexicographer and a teacher of linguistics. Professor, I would like to gently admonish the president for using the word broken to describe a language, especially when there's mutual comprehensibility. It's a running battle I have with my own students and their Caribbean English. But I also want to point out that there's a really interesting dictionary or series of dictionaries by K Dictionaries, Kerneman. And there are about 50 languages that offer multi-translation and cross-cultural and cross-linguistic translation services. And I don't know that Icelandic is one of them, but there are other Scandinavian languages and they're always looking for people to help them. So that's another thing. And I wanted to ask the panelists talking about the changing syntax, or more syntax. English has a fairly rigid syntax and morphological structure. Are you wondering if Icelandic might be losing some morphology as it might be influenced by English? So that's my question.
Yes, we asked in our interview, in our questionnaires, we ask speakers to judge a number of sentences where we think we might see some influence from English syntax. We do not yet have the results from the questionnaire, but it would be very interesting to see whether the judgments of younger speakers, for instance, is different from the older.
So we are running out of time, so I'm going to stop questions here. However, we've not given justice to the panelists and their knowledge. So during break, please feel free to come if you're open to that. Come to question. I want to close with one little anecdote, and this is focused on sort of how to make Icelandic something important. A couple months ago, I retired from Nintendo. I had hundreds of people at an event, at my retirement events. I happened to have decided to buy a couple of hundred copies of the Icelandic soccer logo, KSI. Everybody seen one of these? And I passed them out. And as a part of that, I also taught them to cheer, which it's just wonderful. But here's what I also did. I said to them, I said, in order to get one of these stickers, you have to learn how to say the word that it means. Icelands. And so I had a couple of hundred people learn how to say KSI, the full word. What I found interesting was they were excited by that. They loved doing it. They found it to be so quirky. One sense is that Icelandic can go global by being this very interesting, quirky language that everyone can learn how to speak, like Eakatli and others. So just an idea for everyone, go out and actually tell everyone to support the soccer team of Iceland, number one, and tell them how to say Knattspyrna samband Íslands. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Now the next item on the agenda is a very exciting one and very relevant one, and that is the Icelandic language and the status and future of Icelandic literature. And it's not only the language, it was mentioned in the previous panel that the reading is on the way down, and we, instead of reading something up for you, we showed you a video, which is very telling, actually. The moderator is Anna Gerendine, and she's a counselor of Simon Fraser University, the author of 2 novels, and the editor of Collection of Writing Advice. She has served as a chair of Vancouver International Writers Festival and as a board member of the Writers Trust of Canada and PEN Canada. I'm looking forward to hear about the future of Icelandic literature and is honored to present Anna Gerendine as a moderator.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. I will establish my Icelandic bona fides first, and then I will ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves before we jump into this topic. Notwithstanding the Italian last name, I'm Icelandic origin on my father's side. My grandmother, Agnes, came from Iceland with her parents, Thora and Daniel, in the early 1900s to Gimli, Manitoba, the paradise they found in Canada. I grew up hearing Icelandic stories, spending time with Icelandic aunts and uncles and cousins. And when I got married, I was given vinaterga pants so that I could make vinaterga, which I gather nobody in Iceland eats anymore. It's a big deal. It's a big deal in Gimli, Manitoba. So there you go. So I'll ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we're going to talk about Icelandic literature and the future of the Icelandic language seen through the prism of the remarkable outpouring of writing that comes from Iceland. So I'll start at the far end.
Yes, my name is Birna Björnsdóttir. I'm from Iceland, but I've been living in New York for about 13 years now. But I spend a lot of time in Iceland too, so I'm back and forth a lot. But I'm a writer, and I write in Icelandic. My third novel was published last November in Iceland, and it's called Perlan meint skikkuvæðing íslensku kvenþjóðarinnar í kjölfar efnahagshrunsins. Which, yes, so I used to also be a journalist back in the day, so, but my work is mainly in Iceland.
I'm Chad Post. I'm here from Open Letter Books, which is a publishing house at the University of Rochester that specializes in doing all literature and translation. We started 10 years ago and actually, coincidentally, are celebrating our 10-year anniversary tonight at the gala at the Goethe Institute. But over the past 10 years, we've published 5 so far works from Icelandic, including I brought some examples, Bragi Olafsson's works, Kristen Omerdottir's Children in Regular Woods, which is actually here in Icelandic, and then most importantly, most recently, Thomas Jansson's bestseller by Gudbergur Bergson, which is the height of like postmodern writing in Icelandic literature. And I'll talk about this in a second. We actually ended up doing a whole podcast to help introduce this book to the world and to English readers and give them an entryway into like the myths and the ideas that are behind it. I also run a website called 3%. That's part of our program that promotes international literature. And as part of that, we have a Best Translated Book Award that we give out every year to support international literature. And we created the translation database so you could get actual statistics on what books are being translated into English. That is now hosted by Publishers Weekly, and it's fully searchable, so you can find how many Icelandic women have been translated over the past 10 years, how many books have been translated from Spanish, what publishers are doing which books. You can find all of that information at PW, and I ran a report on Icelandic literature, and it's sitting in my bag down there because I forgot it. And I want to say that over the past 10 years, there have been 58 books that have been translated and published in English of fiction and poetry, which, to put that in perspective, is not bad. I think that's actually in the top, 12 languages that have been translated in English, which is impressive given what we were talking about earlier this morning with the number of speakers and the overall expanse of the Icelandic language.
I'm Adam Gopnik. I've been a writer at the New Yorker magazine for many decades. I am an author, but I sit here in large part because I'm a Canadian, and as a Canadian Jew married into an Icelandic family, a Canadian Icelandic family, which is rather like a hobbit marrying into a family of elves. So I have spent the past 40 years or so being constantly exposed to Icelandic lore and foibles through my wife and her family. I had the great pleasure of coming to Eliza's wonderful literary seminar a few years ago, and then coming back to cover the presidential election when President Jóhannesson won. It was when the New Yorker in that year was 2016. We covered only 2 presidential elections, our own and the Icelandic. So I am absolutely fascinated and intrigued and ever moved by the power of Icelandic culture and Icelandic literature to punch so far above and outside its weight, and it's one of the special preoccupations of my writing.
My name's Eliza Reid, and I know I'm getting introduced very much at this event in the context of who my spouse is. But my actual job is running an annual writers retreat in Iceland for people, and we bring over authors from around the world, including people like Adam Gopnik, who lead writing workshops, and we introduce people to Iceland's literary heritage. And as outreach from that project, I've also been able to participate in a number of cultural festivals run by Iceland Naturally here in North America, where I've delivered speeches about Iceland's literary heritage and our love of literature and these grand traditions here. And so I'm hoping to talk a little bit about that today. I know my husband was sort of understated when he said, oh, I'm pretty good at English, but I'm not bragging when I say that. But because I grew up in Canada and I chose to make Iceland my home, I always feel that entitles me a little bit more to brag about Iceland when I talk about it abroad. So I'll give you the over-the-top views about how fantastic the literary heritage and tradition of this country is. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I will start with the past, and then we'll bring ourselves around to the future, time allowing. So many Icelanders have in their background or their current family Rimmer, am I pronouncing it correct? Poets that published in Icelandic and are known for their literary output. And the Icelanders are famous for the sagas and for being literate for hundreds and hundreds of years, and as storytellers. One of the joys of being in a dark Nordic country is what the heck are you going to do other than make new Icelanders and tell stories? And one of the stories can lead to the other. So just anybody, thoughts about the influence of the sagas, about the history of such a literate society, and the effect of that literacy on the current outpouring of Icelandic writing?
Well, one of the first things that strikes me when we think about that is the completely disproportionate influence of Icelandic literature, and sagas particularly, on English literature. It's one of the remarkable stories. I'm sure there's an academic book about it that exists somewhere that I don't know if it's popular. But if you think about the way, to name only three names, William Morris, W.H. Auden, and J.R.R. Tolkien, all are crucially three major figures, not only wrote brilliantly, but truly changed Anglo-American consciousness and culture, all used, derived, admired Icelandic models. It's quite an extraordinary thing because it's, as I say, it's something about a kind of literary judo that goes on, exactly because of the specific smallness of the Icelandic population. Its possession of an eloquent and highly specific literature makes it an area for exploration. So we all know the influence of Morris, but Auden's Letters from Iceland remains one of the classics of 20th century British travel literature and poetry. The great long poem, Letter to Lord Byron, is set during his trip to Iceland. And of course, the effect of the Icelandic example on Tolkien is overwhelming. And if there's a larger moral in it that I would point to, apart from the superiority of Icelanders, a subject which is often chimed about in my home, it's that part of the magnetism of Iceland outside Iceland is exactly the Icelandic paradox of being simultaneously the most diminutive country with the most specific, as I said a moment ago, the most particularized of cultures and the most particularized of languages. So that sense of discovery, I mean, we were talking in the earlier panel about the boom in Icelandic tourism, which has been so notable. And what I always think about when I'm there, is that it has a kind of paradox built into it. On the one hand, everyone wants to come to Iceland. Everyone in my son's generation, my son is 23, and everyone in his generation wants to go to Reykjavik. It's quite astounding. It's the way they might once have wanted to go to the left bank of Paris or something. And it's partly because everyone speaks English, so they're confident that they won't be lost. But it's also because everyone speaks Icelandic and that they can put themselves in contact with a language and a literature that genuinely feel exotic, still not fully Americanized in that way. And I think that that's a very potent paradox That's one of the reasons that Iceland thrives in the world's imagination so potently.
And I think too, traditionally, there's always been such a strong emphasis within Iceland on being literate, on having this love for literature, and of course, this stems from the sagas, which is something that people could talk about centuries later. But even centuries after that, while there were renaissances in Europe with architecture and art and music, in Iceland, those raw materials to build buildings and to paint works of art, to perform musical pieces, they just didn't exist in the country. And really, people were able to write down their stories. And at the same time, children couldn't be confirmed into the church unless they could show that they were literate. And so the fact that there had been this emphasis placed all the time for many, many, many generations has really continued to the present day, where we see this interest, and I say a lot, it's a sort of a tourist fact, I suppose, about our Christmas book flood, when all of these books get published, and that the book is still the most popular Christmas present to give at Christmas. And in October every year, this catalog is produced where all of the books that are coming out for the year are sent into the household, and it's sort of poured over in the way that the IKEA catalog is poured over, which is it's pretty exciting. And that's something that people talk about every year, is looking forward on Christmas Eve to getting their new plastic wrapped books.
You have like a culture that pours over the book catalog, like we did the Sears catalog in our day. Do children learn the sagas? Are they taught from early days? School?
Yes, we learn. Yes, we read them in school. We learn them in school, and we learn about our literary past. And I think, in many ways, it's connected. It's connected to the future as well. And you say we're storytellers, and I think that's very true. And I think if you go to a dinner party in Iceland, for example, the conversation will often sort of end with people recounting stories, and everyone has their story, and you'll go to a friend group that's been getting together for 10, 20 years, and people just tell the same stories again and again and again, and that's sort of how we talk when we're in big groups, more than sort of like debating things or talking. It's just a very much of a, and I noticed that difference having been living here for a while and in Iceland, like the storytelling element of how we talk to each other. And then the books as well, and we're talking about literature and poetry, and I think, so we're talking about the future, what's going to happen with Icelandic. I tend to be on the optimistic side, the positive side. I think we have all the potential to be in very good shape moving forward. Because there's a very vibrant literary scene. The poetry scene lately has just been exploding. Last Book of Flow, Christmas Book Flood, we had so many beautiful new poetry books, and there's a lot of, and that's sort of where things start happening in literature, like at the poetry level. So there are a lot of things happening, but I also think that with the technology discussion and everything else, we know how few we are, and we know how little, talking about the amount of data, for example, compared to English, we can punch above our weight, as we know, but we also have to put in way more resources than other nations have to do. And I think if we do that, we have huge potential to move forward. And I think we have to use our arts. We have to use literature, our music, our film, all those things. Those are the things that's sort of the pot where it starts happening, and that'll permeate into the culture in other ways and society.
Just add a couple things. One, the Christmas book flood, I mean, the significance of that is amazing, because as a publisher looking for international literature, that's the point in time where we get a lot of contact of like different books that are coming out, new voices, authors that you know that have new books coming out. They're all coming out in November and October, all for the Christmas season, which is cool. It reminds me a bit of, in Catalonia, they have St. Jordi's Day as one day on, I'm going to screw this up, April 23rd, in which everyone goes and buys a book. Women buy a book for a male. Male's supposed to give the woman a flower, but that's sort of sexist and changing. But it's one day in which they celebrate their literary culture in such a profound way. And Catalonia has a similarity in that there aren't a lot of speakers, and yet they're also like have an outsized influence on the rest of the literary world. But what you were saying about all your son's generation wanting to go to Iceland, I've seen for years now, and what's happened out of that in one aspect, in the literary aspect, is that there's a lot of young translators of Icelandic. For a while, when I first started in publishing like 20 years ago, there were like 1 or 2 main Icelandic translators, and I was working at a press that was also interested in international literature, and we're like, hey, we should do Icelandic books, this would be cool. But there was like one person to go to, and that person passed away, and for a time, we're like, oh, yeah, you know, I don't know what we're gonna do. And all of a sudden there's like 6 new people that are all like under the age of 40 or around the age of 40 that are translating at a very high level, that are very promoting Icelandic literature and getting the word out to publishers like me. And I think that came out of this sort of exoticism and like wanting to go to Iceland, plus all this emphasis that's put on the literary culture, that you have a good perfect storm for these people to bring that overseas.
So these are Americans for the most part.
Americans and Canadians.
And Canadians, right,
yeah.
but not Icelanders
Yeah.
who are doing it too. Just to add a note to that, 2 notes. One is that because, and it won't be obscure to anyone in this room, I suspect, but it is still startling when you talk about Martha and I were just in Sweden and in Stockholm, and of course many general traits are shared there too. Highly literate, you can still find bookstores and department stores and so on too. But Sweden's a big place, and Iceland is a tiny place, and I think we sometimes tend to forget just how small. A friend in Iceland once said to me, the core principle in Iceland is never brag about anything, and the core illusion is there are 3 million of us, right? Not 300,000 of us at any time. Just to add something to connect to the previous panel about what you're saying. You know, one of the things we fear most is the loss of smaller languages, and it's a kind of extinction effect or threat that's one of the striking features, the scary features of early 21st century culture. There's, as many people in this room know, there's a great linguistic debate about the degree to which individual languages embody specific worldviews, the degree to which they're untranslatable, incommensurable, and so on. It's a very lively and very complicated linguistic debate. I wrote a long piece about it for the New Yorker about 2 years ago, when there was a dictionary of incommensurable words published and so on. But one thing I think nobody disputes, and no one can dispute, is that literature is the repository of language in that way. And that if a language is lost, the entire literature is lost. That's true whether it's Yiddish or Ladino or Icelandic or any other language. Whatever the specific features of the language may or may not be, the specific qualities of the literature are unquestionably embodied and essential to the expression of the language. And in that way, projects like yours are utterly essential to maintaining the healthy diversity of the world's tongues.
That's very true. There's a wonderful book called Spoken Here by the academic Mark Abley about the few languages that have been rescued really from almost oblivion and brought back to health. And it's not just about the rescue of the language, but about, as you say, the rescue of the unique worldview and a unique literature and a unique way of being. I know when we spoke once, when I was on one of my trips to Iceland, Eliza, that you told me that Icelanders buy each other's books, they hang each other's art on the wall, they share each other, they go to each other's performances of music and theater, that there's a real sense, although we're not supposed to use the word pride associated with Iceland, I gather, a real sense of pride in the Icelandic artistic achievement. So my question is that true? Which you told me it once, so hopefully it is still true. And also, what is translated into Icelandic? What is the filter for that? What do Icelanders read other than their own literature?
Those are two good questions. The short answer to the first one is yes, of course. One of the things that has always impressed me, looking at Iceland maybe from an outsider's eyes, is that that respect for cultural pursuits in all forms that exists in the country. And I remember a woman who attended our writers retreat the very first year who was from New Jersey, and she said to me, when I'm in New Jersey and I tell people I'm a writer and everyone says, okay, but what's your real job? Or they say, well, how do you earn a living? Or so are you like a brochure writer? Or they just were very skeptical about that title. And she said she was in Reykjavik and she went to a cafe and sat down and started talking to someone who said, what do you do? And she said, I'm a writer. And they said, oh, great. Tell me what you're working on right now. What's your latest book? And I think that you would find people more as well in Iceland in general, if you just met someone and started to talk to them, that if you met them and they say, yes, I'm a poet, or I'm a musician, I'm also the Minister of Health, or as the former Minister of Health is a musician as well. So there's a lot of situations like that, I think, and that permeates a lot in society. And what was your? I've completely forgotten.
Well, what culture is brought in? What is
Oh,
the
right.
filter for what gets translated?
yeah.
I believe the president has translated Stephen King into Icelandic.
Yes. We said once in an interview he was young and needed the money, which is sort of a strange explanation for Stephen King. But it's just important to have works available in Icelandic. Whether, of course, it's very important to have books and poetry books that have been written originally in Icelandic, but just having all books accessible for people to read in their native tongue, even though people speak and read at very high levels of, say, English or other languages. So there is proportionally a very high number of books that have been translated into Icelandic from all kinds of different countries. A lot of fiction works. I don't know exactly what the statistics are, and I can't say that there's a lot of a trend, but you would find a lot of books, say, from other Nordic or Scandinavian authors in Icelandic that you wouldn't be able to find, say, in English. But there's certainly a great number of books in English also that get translated into Icelandic.
Comments from anyone else on that topic?
Well, just to say, one of the things that always impresses me in Iceland is not only does every writer do other things, but everyone does 4 things, right? Yeah, so that you meet the assistant mayor of Reykjavik, and he also plays bass in a thrash metal band, and nobody finds that remotely surprising, and that's part of the beauty of the kind of palimpsest of Icelandic culture. The question just to ask is that would you say that, because one of the fascinating things about Iceland, of course, is that at least in the metropolitan areas, cosmopolitan places, there is such a penetration of English and of English speakers. Is that extend to written literature as well? In other words, are people as likely to read a novel or read Stephen King in English, or will they wait and read it in Icelandic?
I think a lot of people would pick up a book and read it in English if it's what they see first. I think that's why there should be an importance on getting works translated quickly, because I think many people would prefer to read the Icelandic translation if it were available, but sometimes it can take a few years. And I think there you get also the nuance in terms of people's level of English comprehension. So somebody, I'll just brag because I'm not born in Iceland, but someone who has English like my husband, he reads books often in English, and other people maybe who are excellent speakers but don't feel as relaxed or comfortable to read a book in English would wait and get the translation. So
I actually think that translating world literature to Icelandic is a huge component in preserving our language, because people there, they do love to read, and if we have it access, and I would say most people would prefer reading in Icelandic if it's available. So that's also something, talking about investment again, that we have to invest more in. That's a huge component, because then the Icelanders, they'll improve their own Icelandic by reading world literature in Icelandic.
There's that kind of old theory of if you go from a much wider spoken language to a smaller one in translation, you tend to improve or add to the language that's being translated into as well, because you find new ways to express things that you hadn't before. Whereas when you go the other way, into English, a lot of American editors tend to domesticize and make language plain. So it is very important, it seems, that you'd be bringing things in and being able to expand and keep.
So is Tolkien in Icelandic better than in English? Who's read Tolkien in Icelandic?
Me.
And is it better? Is there an intensifier? Is there
It's another experience.
Yeah. Now I want to read Tolkien in Icelandic.
It's fascinating in both languages, but as Adam said, you as an Icelander can almost sense, that's where you got that from.
Yes, and it's astonishing actually if you read Tolkien first and then come to the sagas after, to realize how much is there. But of course the thing that's for me is always overwhelming about reading classic Icelandic literature is how psychological it is. That's one of the great.
Including the sagas.
That's what I mean, specifically the sagas, and it still remains to me one of the great mysterious leap forwards in all of world literature, because out of sort of nowhere you get not just a heroic literature, which is one side of it, but the other side that Tolkien picked up is a literature of inward psychological scrutiny.
Out of Hamlet's Hamlet.
Yes, exactly, and that seems, and it's truly one of the kind of great and mysterious saltations, one of the great leaps forwards. It remains fascinating, so much so that our first son is it was on the docket when we went into the delivery room that he'd be called Snorri. Yes, but instead we settled for Auden. In fact, so he would have a link.
Does that inner psychology affect how you write? Do you think having that as your heritage, that inner musing that goes on behind everything in Iceland, inside this?
Well, I mean, Icelanders are, we've been talking a little bit about the characteristics that we're not supposed to brag. And I think I think Icelanders tend to be a bit inward, at least in the beginning, and then when you get to know them or you go out with them, especially in the evenings,
or at the swimming pool.
So I think Icelandic literature is has a lot of psychological examination, because I think because we are, or sort of the character tends to be a little reserved, we probably grow up sort of having to sort of try to read people a bit and sort of try to sort of understand what's going on without the words and without the expression, like very outward expression of communication. So it probably affects the art as well.
Sorry, jump ahead.
That's interesting. In the books we've done from Iceland versus other Scandinavian books that we've published, there's some sort of trend of that sets it apart. And Lytton Smith, who's translated a number of the books for us, was talking about this on our podcast and to my class once, about how a lot of Icelandic literature tends to deal with boxes and rooms. And this shows up when I started to think about it in like all of our books. Like in our frequently our books, regardless of where they're from, don't have a lot of plot. They're much more stylistically interesting. But like Bragi Olufsen's first book, The Pets, that we did, is all about a guy. The entire book takes place with a guy hiding under a bed. And it ends in a way like, we got the full translation, I read it, it ends with him still under the bed, and like someone on top of it having sex, and like, this can't be the end of this book. What is going on here? But then like the more you read of like these Icelandic works, that sort of nature of this kind of boxed in sense. Thomas Jansson is all about like living in his apartment with people encroaching on his apartment, and this idea that he grew up in the pure Iceland and now Iceland's becoming something else, and this sort of struggle between that shows up a lot, and it does have a very psychological sort of inward thinking way about space and about who you are and your identity.
I remember reading, I can't remember where, it might have been the London Times, someone in Iceland describing Icelanders as more indoor people than we imagine. They're pretty smart. You know that it's cold outside, so we spend more time indoors than we might think, not outside in the elements.
That's a Canadian trait as well.
We understand that. So my next question is about noir. And I think probably one of my most favorite New Yorker articles in recent times has been the one about the rescue squads in Iceland, and about the many, many ways in which people can kill themselves by accident in Iceland, or hurt themselves very badly, including all the tourists that get lost down crevasses and so forth. So there is a sense of being near danger, or living in a country where being outdoors can kill you in a lot of different ways. So my question really for any of you is, we talk about Nordic noir and this sense of both its humor and catastrophe through a very, very narrow membrane, I think, that informs a way of being and a way of writing and a way of expressing. So would any of you like to comment on that noir tradition?
I just wanted to add, I remember that New Yorker feature as well, and just as an aside to that, to remind anyone who visits Iceland, that search and rescue crew is entirely voluntary run, and an incredibly, something that we're all very proud of, all of those people who do.
They can save you from many forms of stupidity, but not all forms.
That's right, but it's really an incredible group of people. I think, yes, in terms of more, there is, I think, I can't imagine it, but for centuries, when you do grow up on this isolated island, just nudging the Arctic Circle, and of course, in the olden days, there was this constant threat of famine. There was disease, there were earthquakes, there were volcanic eruptions, and I think really when you live under that constant threat, you don't sweat the small stuff, and so I think that there is this sort of sense of calmness, and because we as human beings have this need, of course, to find the humor in everything, there is a sort of very dark, deadpan humor that you see a lot in the writing or in the conversation. I remember one of our tour bus drivers once, in a completely deadpan way, said something like, it was a winter trip, and we're going to go, and we're going to stop at these places and these places, assuming we don't have a crash and die on the way or something, just with no variation in his tone. And I think that also kind of sort of tends to translate. And I suspect that some of that, again, comes from the isolation, comes from just, yes, learning to not sweat the small stuff.
You know, the globalization of noir is one of the most fascinating literary phenomena of the past 50 years. Because if you think about it at all, where noir fiction originates, essentially with Raymond Chandler in Los Angeles and so on, it's all about cosmopolitan change. It's all about the immigration of the Okies to Los Angeles, and it's all about highly, extremely complicated stratified societies where crime moves up and down, as in Chinatown, let's say, up and down the social ladder in unpredictable ways. And yet in America, in those big cities, noir has become less potent in a certain way. I wrote a long piece for the New Yorker about Florida crime fiction, which all takes place in glare rather than in darkness. But at the same time, what we think of as noir has become a kind of neo-romanticism that's spread through the world. It's a way of evoking the mysterious, the gothic, the dark, using the forgive the word, the tropes of American crime fiction, but extending them out.
That hard-bitten.
Yeah, exactly. The unsentimental quality, highly unsentimental quality. So the existence of Scandinavian noir and Icelandic noir in particular is an astonishing thing. It's a hugely adaptive thing too. It's a way of taking a living genre and domesticating it, making it part of the indigenous culture.
I would disagree with that. I don't have anything to add. Like, it is interesting from the publishing perspective that we've sort of shifted from like Los Angeles through like French crime writing and Italian and then up to Scandinavian more recently as being like the more trendy aspect. And that kind of coolness of it and the sort of brutality of it is very remarkable, especially like in Iceland where there are no lawyers and then you have all these like these books that are filled with them.
Exactly.
Any comments about noir as a genre? What about other genres? That's an easy thing for us to fall into, Nordic noir.
I think just in general, we're talking about Icelandic literature spreading to other countries and other languages. I think if we think about the tourism boom that we've had, President Guðni, and that's another thing about the Icelandic language. We actually call our president by the first name, which is people here find shocking, but that's one thing that goes along with our language. Said that we had over 2 million tourists last year.
24,000 tons.
Compare it to the fish catch.
That's an extraordinary number.
And they were weighing us when we arrived. As we come out of the airport, you're weighing us?
Well, we have catch and release programs.
Well, so these 24,000 tons of people, they've been there. And they're interested in Iceland now. And I've been living here for a number of years. And just in the past, I would say 5 years, the interest in, there's such a huge, the interest in Iceland has grown so much. Like everyone I meet and learns that I'm Icelandic, they want to tell me about their trip there. They want to tell me about the trip that their hairdresser went last week. They want to tell me about the trip their kids are planning to go this summer. And so it's huge, and they all seem to enjoy. Well, the people that talk, they won't say anything else. They seem to enjoy their trips. They're very interested in the country, and they want to know more. They're interested in the culture, so they seek out the music. They seek out the TV shows and films. They want to look for more books. We have, just one person like Chad. It's amazing that he has interest in Icelandic literature, and he's published a number of Icelandic books. That's amazing, and one person like that, and another person here, and Adam Gopnik writing about Iceland for the New Yorker, and things like this, they really help us in this outsized influence and attention we get. So I think that we should sort of take advantage of this huge interest in us at this moment. All these millions of people that are interested. So again, if we talk about resources and investment, if the Icelandic government really just makes a huge effort in putting some money into the translating and sort of getting it out there, I think it would be a huge benefit not just to us as a business, but also to our culture and our language, and our language sort of continuing to blossom and continuing to thrive.
Can I add just, I hope not a negative note, but a kind of nor even a warning note, but a kind of salutary note. Is that inevitably, when you have a small, extremely distinct and exotic culture, it's going to become a place of projection. It's going to become a place where people who come from much larger and more model cultures will project values, good and bad. So we all went through the other side of it right after the crash, right? When for a brief period of time, Iceland was being projected as the innocent rubes who got taken and tried to take. It's easy to fall into cliche when you're coming from a big culture and looking at a smaller one. And the cliches can sometimes be hugely positive in ways that are slightly unreal, and they can sometimes, therefore, they can sometimes turn and become negative and equally unreal.
Yes, yes, that's a really good point. And that's why I think it's hugely important for more nuanced things to get out there, such as literary fiction, things that are not just these tropes that everybody knows, like the stereotypes. If our more sort of nuanced cultural products get out there, we'll get a more complex identity elsewhere.
Yes.
Us Icelanders.
It's hard to get ahead of, though. I spent a lot of time in Italy, which is a similar way, has a lot of expectations imposed on it about what the Italian experience will be like. Yes. And after a certain point, it's really a battle to fight those expectations.
We got into with Thomas Johnson. Let's keep going back to this. With our the podcast, the 2-month review, we spent 10 episodes, like an hour a week, going through like a few, like 20, 30 pages of this book, because it's very dense. It's very much, the linguistic elements are incredible. It reminds you of like Ulysses plus Kafka plus all those things. It's complicated. It's very complicated. But at its core, what the overall discussion became over the 10 weeks was about all of the sort of paradoxes inherent in this book and inherent in being Icelandic, in the sense that there's like this uniqueness to the culture, and yet you're trying to expose it to the world, which brings in all these other influences that sort of mediate that isolationist aspect. Plus, like, this book really hones in on someone who is sort of very nationalistic and the dangers of that, but also the trappings of like wanting to promote your culture. So it got into a really interesting place discussion-wise in terms of like the elements that we're talking about, where there's this balance of like the perceptions and how that plays out, be it positive or negative, and then like the reality and the nuance to it and how these keep interacting throughout time and throughout like literary history and throughout like the cultural history. I highly recommend it. I'm going to just pitch one more time.
Thomas
Johnson.
Great. All right. We've gone through, well, one last question. Do we have time for one last question?
Sure.
We've gone through in Canada recently a kind of a rend in the literature about allowing new voices into to write and hearing new voices, and in particular Indigenous voices, rather than have the non-Indigenous people speak for them. So my question is, I know, what is it, about 10% of Icelandic population now?
Over 10%.
Is from abroad. I don't know what that is in kilos. And they're learning Icelandic, I hope. So will there be a literature by the newcomers to Iceland? Is there going to be a contribution by them? Is that happening?
I certainly hope so, speaking as one of those just over 10%. I think obviously because of the language, there's sort of an additional challenge there in the sense that for people like me who moved to the country as an adult or who didn't learn the language as a child, I speak good Icelandic, but my Icelandic would never be good enough to write a book in the language. And so I think we aren't this influx of immigration that hasn't happened is recent enough that we haven't seen that be reflected, I think, in the literature yet. I think we will see that more with the children of immigrants who will grow up bilingual or will have Icelandic as a mother tongue and perhaps another tongue, who will still have a different lens on the country. But as Birna said, I'm an optimist not only with the language but overall as well. And I think that there would be an appetite within Icelandic society for stories like that, for books like that. And I think a genre that we talk a lot about, say, noir, just to diverge a little bit, I think another genre that's very popular in Iceland that just doesn't, for obvious reasons, get translated very often is biography or autobiography and nonfiction books. Because again, it's a small country, and so it's very, very common for people who have attained some sort of public profile in whatever sense to either write a book themselves or have a book written about themselves, because a great many people know them, or they've had perhaps some sort of unique upbringing or experience. And so I think that the children of immigrants will have a different perspective on the country, and I think that there will be an interest among that for people to read that. I think people will see that those are important stories we need to tell.
Last words from anyone else before we have
Can,
to hook?
if you'll forgive me, I'll tell a very quick, but I think funny Icelandic Canadian story, which will mean something. I'm an insane sports fan. One of the greatest thrills of my life was that our son, Luke Auden, and I were in Iceland when Iceland defeated England. I will never forget being in the...
That was amazing. I was
in
in
a
a bar
metro,
with Lytton.
exactly.
We were watching
central,
that. It was
in the central
We were at the game, so I'm just saying.
I know, you've traveled. President Guðni had just been elected 2 days before.
Right there.
And Thomas Jóhannesson, if anybody is a Canadian hockey fan will know, so my wife, Martha, would often tell me about her uncle, Thomas Jóhannesson, and so on, and her great-uncle, Thomas Jóhannesson. And it took me about 5 years to realize that was Tom Johnson, who's a Hall of Fame hockey player. And her life was so bifurcated between the two things that it took 2 years to figure out that Uncle Thomas Jóhannesson was Tom Johnson, in fact, too.
Amazing.
That's if you're a Canadian, you'll appreciate that story.
Makes sense. I think we have the hook.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So on that note, thank you very much. And then now to the closing. Stefania Guðrún Halldórsdóttir is Executive Vice President, Marketing and Business Development at Landsvirkjun, the national power company. She works in the games industry, leading international teams in Iceland, US and China for CCP game, and prior to that, she worked in the energy industry. Stefania is the chairman for the Almannarómur, Voice of the People, for those who don't speak Icelandic, a self-owned foundation which has the purpose to develop language technology solution for Icelandic. Stefania holds master's degree in environmental science from the engineering facility from the University of Iceland, and I'm greatly honored to present Stefania Guðrún Halldórsdóttir, and from my personal point of view, thank you very much for being here. It's as usual, you make these things happen. Thank you very much. Stefania.
Hi all, and thank you for having me, and thank you, Hlynur, for inviting me to have to put the final words here. I want to put things a little bit in context, because for me, I had a meeting the other day. Like Jon said, I was elected chairman of Almannarómur, the Voice of the People, several months ago, and I had a meeting the other day with two gentlemen in Iceland, and where everything was put in context. We sat down. This was Jon Sigurdsson and Ármann Jakobsson from the Icelandic Literary Society. And we sat down in a meeting, and they started telling me stories, as you do. And and those stories, all of a sudden, connected everything for me. And I wanna share this connection with you now, and everything that has been said here, and everything that has been brought here. It feeds somehow into this connection and into those stories. So, 200 years ago, the economic conditions in Iceland were in a sorry plight, and the intellectual life was in a state of semi-stagnation. There were two dominating factors. On the one hand, it was the Lutheran orthodoxy that people had been focusing on. And on the other hand, it was the pursuit of old Icelandic studies and poetry. The policy of reason and enlightenment was widely spread in Europe, and the Icelandic leaders were in favor of the enlightened absolutism. But the language spoken in Iceland by the ordinary people had been subjected to unhealthy influences from various quarters, from Danish business community and officialdom. The written language was rather corrupted, which was only natural because Icelandic wasn't taught back then, 200 years ago. And publishing of books in Icelandic had almost ceased. A Danish philologist, Rasmus Christian Rask, came to Iceland to learn Icelandic. He had made a detailed study of Icelandic for which he had developed a great liking. And he wanted to gain first-hand experience of the language, how it sounded from the lips of the people. To his horror, he discovered that the Icelandic language was in great danger. New medium, print, and post was not helping. It was rather contributing to the death of the language. Rask knew it would not be long until the language would disappear if nothing would be done to remedy the situation. Even some educated Icelanders regarded the language as one of the dead ones, such as Anglo-Saxon and Gothic. He felt the need for strong action, believing that the most practical method would be to start a society for the advancement of Icelandic literature, the preservation of the language, and the protection of the language. And he recognized that they had to start using the new medium and had to start printing books again, and start printing books in Icelandic. So a group of enthusiasts with Rask founded the Icelandic Literary Society, and it has been publishing written material in Icelandic for over 200 years now. And now 200 years later, we have a similar problem. New media is here, and Icelandic is not represented in this media, as many of the people who have spoken here have told us, and they've described this in many ways, and I'm really thankful for the depth of this symposium, of the depth that people could bring into this subject. And when my 18-year-old, he has his Google phone, and he talks to his Google phone. He's not always looking up people like I do, like I'm going to call, like, He's like, hey, Google, call mom. I'm listed under mom on his phone, not mama. And as Guðni said earlier, why isn't he saying, hey, Sigríður, hringdu nú í mömmu fyrir mig. And then, just recent news. So at least, when Google calls mom, I could pick up the phone, my son speaks to me in Icelandic, and he's speaking himself to me. Maybe asking, hey, what's for dinner? Something really important in his life. But now, Google has a way, it just came out, maybe Google can make the phone call for you. You don't have to speak for yourself. So maybe one day, a mom in Iceland gets a phone call. It's, hey Google, call mom. And Google said, and call mom and ask what's for dinner. And Google calls mom and it's like, hey mom, what's for dinner? I would really prefer that Google would then speak to this mom and say, Sælmóðir, geturðu sagt mér hvað í kvöldmatinn? Something like that. But then, the other day, and those stories come, it's really interesting how those stories come back and come into the symposium about the Icelandic kids speaking in English. 2 11-year-old boys speaking Icelandic, grew up in Iceland. The other day, they were speaking in English to each other. And one of the dads overheard the conversation and said, hey, why aren't you speaking Icelandic? I said, Icelandic? Icelandic is not our language. It's your language. We speak English. But the fact is, English is not the language. I know this for a fact because I moved abroad with my kids and my teenager. They went to international school, and I can tell you, the YouTube English does not help in studying math, science, politics, talking about environmental issues, or talking about your feelings and emotions and go into the depths. So I think it's wrong to think that the Icelandic children will do well in international setting later, just because they can talk speak English to their gadgets, and that they can speak English while they play. I call it the YouTube English. So, again, we have a call to action. And in 2014, Almannarómur, the Voice of the People, was founded. It's a self-owned foundation with the purpose to help developing language technology for Icelandic. The initiative came from people in the academia, and some of them are here. And they wanted, those people had been working on language technology, and they wanted to get more people involved, and they wanted especially to reach out to other sectors in the society. And the founding members of Almannarómur were over 20. It's universities and research institutes, it's various companies in Iceland, it's energy companies, it's IT companies, it's insurance companies, it's financial institutions and travel companies, and organizations of disabled people. Each of the founding members paid a small initial contribution, $1,200 to $600, just to get the foundation going. So again, a group of people have recognized, and I think it's not a group of people, I think it's a wave. I think there is a wave starting, and I agree with you all that this kind of, like how Icelandic stands out as this quirky language, and I have a similar experience to Ingvar, where my son, my 12-year-old, he was having his goodbye party in Shanghai in his international school, and I had bought those caps which said, "Ei, ja, fjalla, jökull," and we distributed them, and all the 12-year-olds were like, and they're probably carrying them and telling them, I don't know how to speak Icelandic. So I think that there is a wide interest in this quirky language. And I think there is a wave, and we have recognized that there is that a major undertaking is necessary still, if the Icelandic language is to survive. And this was the revelation for me. We have done this before, and we will do it again. And we've probably done this many times before. And here we are, 200 years later, when people thought 200 years ago we would not be speaking Icelandic today. So I think in 200 years, I hope, and I really hope that people will still be speaking Icelandic. And this can be turned around. And this wave is also going on because there have been questions around what is the vision in Iceland, and are there some real resources being allocated to the matter in Iceland? And I am very hopeful because I see real resources being put into the matter. The Ministry of Education, Science and Culture has developed a detailed plan for the Icelandic language technology. 3 language technology experts, Anna being one of them, and as she described this earlier, they were commissioned to work out a detailed 5-year plan for Icelandic language technology. And in the report, which was delivered to the Minister in June 2017, the main emphasis is laid down on 4 tasks. It's speech recognition, speech synthesis, machine translation, and language resources. And in addition, in this plan, there is a comparative research and development fund established, which is really important. And last November, a new government came to power, and in the policy statement, and I cannot speak for any of the ministries or for the government, or whatever, but in the policy statement of that government, it is explicitly stated that finance will be allocated for a plan of action on language technology to ensure that Icelandic will be usable in all technology. The total cost of the language technology project is estimated over 2 billion Icelandic krona, which is approximately $23 million. On the budget law for 2018, 1/5 of that sum, approximately $5.4 million, is allocated to language technology. And Almannarómur is now waiting for the call, this being advertised, because we will apply, of executing on this program. And one part, and Anna said this earlier in the panel, one part of this whole plan is that we realize we cannot do this alone. Like, we can develop technology and we can do speech recognition and all of that, but we need the whole technical industry to work with us. We need all of you to work with us. We need everyone on board on pushing this, because if we stop talking about it, it will absolutely not happen. And if we stop, we need to continue this action. And I agree with so many people who've said this as well in here, that now is the time. And for me, I think if we don't do it now, because the new medium is different from before. Like, we've had television and computer games and all of that. People watch it and they consume it. But it's different when you start talking to those devices. It's completely different. And what then when they start making the phone calls for you? It is a real threat, like has been said here before so many times. So I'm really thankful for seeing so many people pay interest to this. And I've been speaking to people here who have just general interest and are not from Iceland and don't have necessarily the connection. We need all of you. So, and then just having regard to the fact that Icelandic is spoken by 350,000 people, it's obvious that a conscious and determined effort is needed if it is to be preserved in a world of rapid progress and constantly improving means of communication. Because preserving the language is the basis of the intellectual and economic advancement of the nation. Thank you all.